Welcome back, everyone. Today's explainer is an absolutely fascinating look at the Industrial Revolution. We're going to look at the exact mechanics of how a massive leap in technology created this profound ripple effect across the entire globe. We're talking unprecedented prosperity for some and steep, steep economic decline for others. It is literally a textbook case of historical cause and effect. So we've put together a highly visual, structured breakdown, lots of pictures, classic HSC style, to make these complex concepts super easy to understand.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Our roadmap today covers the mechanized shift, capitalism and England's rise, the impact on India, the rise of economic nationalism, and finally, the cycle of imperialism.
Section 1. The mechanized shift.
Before we can look at the sweeping global impacts, we first need to understand the fundamental engine of this era. Based on our sources, the Industrial Revolution is officially defined as the transition from manual production to mechanized production. Taking place throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, this shift was entirely driven by steam and water power coming into use for industrial production. I mean, it sounds simple on paper, right? But taking handcrafting out of the equation and replacing it with machine making, that changed the global economy forever.
But here is the key takeaway, and it's absolutely crucial. The Industrial Revolution could really only happen within a very specific economic framework. Our source material breaks down the raw mechanics of a capitalistic economy super clearly. We see the emergence of an entirely new class of capitalists who held private ownership of industrial establishments. And their primary goals? Producing commodities with the absolute minimum production cost and paying the lowest possible wages. Why? Well, to maintain maximum profit margins, of course. And built right into the foundation of this system is the manufacturer's inherent right to fix the prices of those goods.
Section 2. Capitalism and England's rise.
Now, what's really interesting here is taking those economic rules and applying them to one specific location to see how it triggered an absolute economic explosion. It is amazing how perfectly England's geography matched those capitalist mechanics outlined in our source material. England already had massive amounts of iron ore and coal available underground. On top of that, its damp, humid climate was just naturally perfect for producing cotton yarn. These wildly favorable natural conditions basically created the perfect storm for the textile industry to take root and flourish.
However, the natural resources at home simply weren't enough to feed these incredibly efficient new machines forever. As the source text details, England had already established political colonies in many other countries. This meant they could easily bypass normal trade barriers and grab massive quantities of essential raw materials at extraordinarily cheap rates. Then, they would process those cheap materials into finished goods, ship them right back to those very same colonies, and sell them with massive profit margins.
So we get this highly effective, pretty ruthless formula for optimum costs. England utilized its advanced naval facilities for the large-scale export of goods to its vast colonial territories. Combine that captive market with the availability of exceptionally cheap labor, and boom, they maintained an optimum level of costs. The result? Massive capital accumulation for British merchants. The incredible profits they earned in the colonies provided the massive financial fuel that ultimately prepped the ground for the full-scale onset of the Industrial Revolution in England.
Section 3. The impact on India.
You know, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Here we pivot sharply to look at what England's rapid industrial rise meant for the territories under its control. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark dual impact we mentioned at the very beginning of this explainer. On one side of the ledger, the Industrial Revolution brought immense prosperity and progress to England. But on the exact opposite side, looking directly at the textbook sources, it led directly to decline, forced dependency, and severe economic exploitation for India. The details in our source material explicitly outline how the administrative policies of the East India Company weren't just, accidental. They were deliberately engineered to benefit the British at the direct expense of the Indians. The overarching goal of the administration was maximum profit for the British, pure and simple, and it came at a truly catastrophic cost to the local economy. In fact, the source highlights one historically devastating reality. Because of this massive industrial shift and the resultant colonial policies, the traditional textile industry in India almost completely came to a halt. Centuries of a thriving, self-sustaining Indian cottage industry were abruptly dismantled, virtually overnight, by a legally protected flood of cheap, machine-made British goods. Even physical infrastructure had a dual purpose in this era. In history, we often view the introduction of railways as a universal sign of progress and modernization, right? But the source specifically notes that in this context, the railways made it possible to easily transport those European goods deep into the rural areas of India for sale. So instead of simply connecting people, the railway network was actively turned into a powerful logistical tool for the monetary exploitation of the local population.
Section 4. Rise of Economic Nationalism.
This brings us to a fascinating macro-level shift. Let's look at how this unprecedented wealth and structural exploitation naturally evolved into a rigid international policy. The textbook introduces a crucial term here that you definitely need to know: economic nationalism. It's defined precisely as arresting the economic growth of rival nations while fervently pursuing the economic growth of your own nation. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how goods were manufactured, it directly birthed this highly combative, zero-sum economic philosophy on the world stage.
And according to the source text, this wasn't just some passive idea discussed in parliaments. It required aggressive, real-world tactics. Nations devised complex ways to put tight economic restrictions on any rival country. This meant taking severe measures like prohibiting the import and export transactions of other nations and levying incredibly heavy tolls on their goods. It was essentially a form of economic warfare specifically designed to protect industrial advantages. Let's move along and see how this builds into what the source accurately calls a vicious circle. It works in a highly logical step-by-step loop. Step 1, your machines generate a massive chain of surplus production. Step 2, to feed those hungry machines, you need to maintain an unbroken, ever-expanding supply of cheap raw materials. Step 3, because you now have so much surplus production, you need to constantly capture brand new marketplaces to sell it. And Step 4, you aggressively implement economic nationalism to protect all of those colonial investments from your European rivals.
Section 5. The Cycle of Imperialism.
This brings us to the final, inevitable stage of this historical progression, where economic policy formally morphs into sweeping global conquest. The textbook outlines specific drivers that supported this push for further imperialism: an economy entirely based on surplus production, extreme nationalism, industrialization itself, concepts of racial superiority, and aggressive colonial policies. Remaining strictly impartial to the text, it's critical to note how these sources document that deeply ingrained concepts, like racial superiority, were actively utilized at the time to justify and structurally support further imperial expansion.
And this leads directly to a really sobering historical fact highlighted in the material. Establishing these new colonies in Asian and African countries didn't just happen via peaceful trade agreements. As the text explicitly states, fighting battles with the natives of the colonies literally became a core part of economic nationalism. The real-world human cost of war and subjugation was officially justified under the banner of protecting a nation's industrial and economic interests. The ultimate result of this vicious cycle was massive physical and global domination. As documented in the source text, it led directly to the immense physical expanse of European empires across the globe. Small, industrialized European nations like England, France, Belgium, and Germany aggressively carved up entire continents, and this was driven largely by the need to feed the unbroken chain of surplus production and endless market demand created by their factories.
So, what does this all mean for us? The crucial point is that understanding the step-by-step mechanics of the Industrial Revolution isn't just about memorizing the past. It's about recognizing the literal foundation of modern geopolitics and international trade. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling question to consider. How much of today's global economy is still fundamentally shaped by this historical cycle of surplus production and economic nationalism? Are we still, in many ways, living in the ripples of that initial mechanized shift? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think on that.